Hi everyone, my name is Zach, and procedural textures, which I've showed you in the last videos, are limited. So we can't create every kind of texture out of this. So that means sometimes we have to use image textures. And if we have a case like here for our dynamic topology sculptings, I would recommend to use seamless textures. That means these are textures which you can put side by side, and there you won't see the tiling. So, and the cool thing is there's a nice workflow which we can use to project this onto our object without creating a UV map and without visible seams. Yeah, and without further words, let's get started. And there are tools which can generate a seamless texture nearly out of every photo, for example PixPlant. I already covered this topic in a free tutorial which you can find online. The link to this tutorial you'll find in the video description. So now let's add a seamless texture. I press Shift A, Image Texture, Open. And here I have a texture from the Seamless Texture Pack Volume 2 from iceclots.com. And now connect this with the base color. And as you can see, nothing really is happening. I can't see any texture on the surface. And that's because as standard texture coordinates, this is using UV. That means if we had created a UV map for our object, this texture would show up. But if we don't have a UV map, which we don't want to create because we have our dynamic topology sculpting here, we can use the generated input again. But again, this will scale the texture according to the size of the object. And because of that, I would recommend to use the object input. So now we have another problem. If we take a look from this side here, on the sides, this texture will be stretched. And that's because here under the image texture settings, we have the flat projection enabled. And that means basically the image will be projected flat from the top and the bottom onto this object. And instead I would recommend to switch to box projection. That means from 6 sides, like a box, the texture will be projected on the object. But now we have a little problem. If we take a closer look here. So in actual fact, you can barely see it with this texture, but here in these areas, you can now see some seams here. Because this is an organic shape and not a cube. And then it can happen that we see the seams. But no problem. This box projection offers this blend slider, and if I slowly increase this to 0.1 for example, this seams will be smoothed out. So if I increase this even more, you can see we have a little bit of blending here. A value of 0.1 or 0.2 is in most cases fine. And now we have this seamless texture basically projected seamlessly onto our organic shape. And now again, the same thing as before, we can now quickly create a bump map and a roughness map out of this. So I just want to mention again, this is not physical accurate to do it in this way, but it is super quick. And in many cases, this leads to a result which is at least acceptable. So let's take a look at the bump map here. Let's decrease the values and let's take a look at the roughness. That means the cracks here will be more shiny and the rest not. Let's take a look on how this looks like. And now we have this very simple concrete cat. Certainly I would decrease the glossiness here a bit. So, and another cool thing I want to show you here in general, this also can be used for procedural textures. We can add, for example, under color, we have this RGB curves or this hue saturation node, which we can put after our image textures and then, for example, change the hue here. That means the color basically, or the saturation, how strong this color should be. That means we can edit our textures on the fly. And super easy, as you can see, we can change the color, the complete color of this texture with just a few clicks. And imagine you want to create different color variations of this texture. This is pretty cool. And in this way, you can also use the same texture with a little bit of color variation. And for this, for example, I use a texture, noise texture with the object texture coordinates. And then under color, I use a mix RGB node. And up here, color ramp as well. And now again, I have this noise texture, which is defining a black and white texture mask. This we use as input for this mix node. And here we can mix the texture with something else. But here I just add color, use saturation node, duplicate this, use this as second input, and now just change the colors here, saturation for example. And yeah, this is just a very simple example. Now we have used the same texture and vary the color a bit, and the different variations will be displayed through this noise texture. As you can see, these are just very simple tricks to adjust our texture on the fly. So it's just like using an image manipulation program and play around with some different filters. And here we can just do the same thing directly in Blender to edit our textures on the surface of our object. So I just deleted some of the nodes here because I just want to show you one other very important thing. If you're using the object texture coordinates or also other things like UV or generated, we can still scale our texture. So if we realize that this texture here is displayed too big or too small, we can change this. And this we can do with a mapping node. So I hit Shift A, vector mapping, and this I put between the texture coordinate and the image texture node. And now you can see we not only can scale our texture, we also can rotate and move our texture. So let's take a look at this crack here. For example, if I move this in the Z direction, you can see in this case it's going downwards. So let's move this in the other direction. We basically can move our texture. Also, you can rotate the texture and you can scale the texture. So if you want to make this texture bigger, you have to take a value between 0 and 1. So if I select all of them, press 0.5 for example, you can see we are zooming in. Now we are zooming even more in. And if we want to have more details, that means the texture will get smaller, we have to take values above 1, like 2 for example. You can see it's getting smaller, 5, 10, and so on. You can see now we have a lot of details in here. But now we also can see the repetition of this texture. Yeah, and in this way you also can control how this texture is displayed on the surface of the object. Yeah guys, that's it with this video, and as you can see, with seamless textures you easily can shade your complete model, similar like you would use procedural textures.